We established that the biblical flood was a global event. Now let's cover the post-flood, the aftermath of the flood. Main points. 1. What key events happened post-flood that can still prove a global flood? And 2. Can the events of the post-flood tell us the age of the earth? For topic number 1, we're going to touch on 2 important points. 1 is Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, and 2 is the Ice Age. Let's begin with Walt Brown explaining what the hydroplate theory is and why it proves a global flood. Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit educational or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
Could it be that hidden within this simple description, the answers to the skeptic's most difficult questions may be found? Having served as director of one of the United States Defense Department's major research and development laboratories, Dr. Walter Brown comes with an impressive list of credentials and credibility. In tackling the subject of Earth's geological development, Dr. Brown has developed a theory that contradicts the generally accepted viewpoint of the scientific community. Profound and far-reaching, this respected scientist's hydroplate theory not only offers a completely new approach to the geological sciences, it succeeds where the prevailing theory often fails. It simply and logically explains some of the Earth's most profound mysteries.
We can see on our planet 25 major features that can now be systematically explained as a consequence of a global flood that erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 30 trillion hydrogen bombs. This theory shows us just how rapidly major mountains form. It explains the coal, oil, and methane deposits, the rapid continental drift, and why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. This theory also explains the ice ages, and it gives the primary reason for global warming. It explains the formation of the layered strata in almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. Surprisingly, it explains the origin of comets, of asteroids, and of meteorites.
According to Dr. Brown's theory, the ancient world that Noah lived in was very different from the Earth we occupy today.
Noah and other pre-flood people probably lived on one very large supercontinent with lush vegetation, inland seas, and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. Before the flood, about half the Earth's water was in interconnected chambers, about 10 miles below the Earth's surface. This formed a thin spherical shell, almost a mile thick. The pressure in the subterranean chamber had been increasing for centuries because the gravity of the sun and moon produced tides in the subterranean water that lifted and lowered the Earth's massive crust twice a day. This tidal pumping added gigantic amounts of energy to the subterranean water. This increasing pressure in the subterranean water steadily stretched the crust as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began as a microscopic crack that grew in both directions at almost 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched claw. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. The Bible even gives us a precise date, the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. Then it says, and the rain fell. The fountains of water jetted supersonically into and above the atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The supersonic fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the widening crack. This produced huge volumes of sediments that settled through the floodwater, trapping and burying plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Eventually, the crack became so wide that the newly exposed floor of the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of approximately 40 to 50 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, and like a runaway crashing train, they compressed, crushed, buckled, and thickened, rising out of the floodwaters. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated.
This theory of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity appears to support the biblical story of the deluge in every detail. But what other evidence exists to support this amazing theory?
In 1970, I predicted that large pools of salt water would be found beneath major mountains. That prediction has been confirmed in several ways, by gravity studies, by seismic studies, and by electromagnetic studies.
A paper published in the April 2001 issue of Science magazine announced the discovery of an electrically conductive layer under the Tibetan Plateau. The article suggested that such high conductivity at depths of approximately 10 miles could be achieved by a layer of aqueous fluids, some 1.6 kilometers thick and containing 10% brine. In other words, salt water.
Just how big these subterranean layers of water will turn out to be, no one really knows, but the article points out that the conductivity is evident across the entire Tibetan Plateau.
Recently, even more evidence to support Dr. Brown's theory became available. On March 22, 1998, a group of boys playing basketball in Monahans, Texas, narrowly missed being struck by a 3-pound meteorite that crashed to the ground 40 feet from where they were playing. The police were notified, and 48 hours later, NASA scientists cracked the meteorite open in a clean room laboratory. What they discovered inside stunned them all. The meteorites contained salt crystals and liquid water.
The NASA scientists who investigated this meteorite believe it came from an asteroid. That's unlikely, because asteroids in the vacuum of space cannot sustain liquid water, which is required to form salt crystals. It's also too cold, and there's too little gravity. Earth is the only body in the solar system that can sustain liquid water on its surface. This demonstrates the enormous power of the subterranean supercritical water, the fountains of the great deep, that launch water and rock fragments into orbit around the sun. These rock fragments are still returning to the Earth as meteorites. Meteorites contain Earth-like material, including many types of living but dormant bacteria. This means that meteorites and their bacteria didn't originate in the vacuum of space. Meteorites are literally tiny chunks of the Earth itself returning home.
Scientists are also scratching their heads over another recent discovery. On the Kola Peninsula in northern Russia, they have created the world's deepest hole, extending to a depth of 7.5 miles. At this depth, what they expected to find was a layer of basalt, Earth's most common type of volcanic rock. What they actually discovered was something entirely different.
The hole didn't reach the basalt underlying the granite continents, but to everyone's surprise, they did reach hot, salty water flowing through crushed granite. Geologists are mystified, but the hydroplate theory provides a simple explanation.
Did the springs of the great deep burst forth and flood the entire Earth, just as the Bible says? Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory offers us a plausible scientific explanation for how this may have happened. But is there something more important to this theory? Could it be yet another example of the supernatural engineering observed throughout the Bible? If we now know where the water of the Great Flood came from, the same water that was instrumental in forming the fossil record, then when the Great Flood receded, where did all the water go? The answer to that question not only bolsters the scientific theory that a worldwide flood actually took place, it also provides an alternative explanation for the formation of one of the world's greatest natural wonders.
This is the question that stops most scientific investigators dead in their tracks. Yet the hydroplate theory makes the answer obvious. As the hydroplates crashed, they thickened and rose out of the water, forcing the floodwaters over the continents to recede. Simultaneously, upward surging subterranean water was choked off. As the floodwater drained off the continents, every continental basin was left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes. During the following centuries, some lakes breached their boundaries by either spilling over their rims or undercutting their banks. The rapid, catastrophic discharge of these lakes, much like the collapse of a large dam, carved canyons. Several centuries after the flood, two very large ancient lakes, Grand Lake and Hopi Lake, sitting on top of the high, rising Colorado Plateau, breached their boundaries and carved the Grand Canyon in just a few weeks. The massive canyon was not carved by the relatively small Colorado River over millions of years. That river is a consequence of the carving of the Grand Canyon.
Can the residual waters of Noah's flood account for the amazing natural beauty of the Grand Canyon? If Dr. Brown's theory is correct, then the Grand Canyon was carved only a few thousand years ago, and nearly every geology textbook needs to be rewritten.
One has only to look at the Earth's anomalies to see that the hydroplate theory provides a far better explanation of the Earth's present condition than the other more prevalent, well-propagated, but highly implausible theories.
Were key geological markers, like the Grand Canyon, formed over millions of years? Or did they come to be within the short time frame of Noah's flood? The hydroplate theory, which supports the story of Noah's flood, says it was the latter. If that is true, what better example of supernatural engineering could one ask for?
What is that? Well, it's a poetic description. The Hebrew scholars will tell us it's a poetic description of a physical reality. And we wouldn't have known about this 100 years ago because we didn't understand the deep ocean floor. It's an interesting story about what happened in the history of geological thought. And in the 1850s, a guy called Antonio Snyder Pellegrini, he actually was one of the first that looked at the jigsaw puzzle fit of North and South America with Europe and Africa. And he put it back together and said, well, what happened if the fountains of the Great Deep were molten material coming up in big volcanic eruptions that broke up the pre-flood supercontinent and pushed it apart?
So he was looking at this from a Genesis paradigm.
Absolutely. He was thinking, the Bible describing all the waters to gather together in one place at the time of creation, so the land was in one place, and the fountains of the Great Deep represented a pre-flood pseudocontinent that was split apart by volcanism, by volcanic activity coming up through rifts and splitting it apart. And he was thinking of continental sprint, the pre-flood supercontinent breaking apart and the fragments sprinting across the surface of the Earth to open up the Atlantic Ocean and produce the configuration of continents that we had today. Now, his ideas weren't taken on board immediately. Even the idea of continental drift, slow and gradual, wasn't proposed in the conventional scientific community until the early 1900s. And for over 50 years, those who proposed the idea of continental drift, and they were thinking in terms of slow and gradual over millions of years because that was their paradigm of thinking, they were opposed and they were ostracized. And this is a good illustration of what can happen with a paradigm change. After the Second World War, governments released maps of the ocean floor that they had developed as part of their submarine warfare. And suddenly, the geologists discovered that there were these mountain chains in the middle of the ocean basins. And they started to explore it. And within 10 years, there was a total paradigm shift. Before, you were scorned if you believed in continental drift. Now it's the reigning paradigm. It's called plate tectonics. The reason it's called plate tectonics is because it's not just the continents that fractured, it was also the ocean floor. And today we have a mosaic of plates that make up the outer skin of the Earth, the crust. Some of those, like the Pacific Ocean floor, is one plate, and it's pushing against the North American plate. And where it slides past one another, it's along the San Andreas Fault in California, which produces earthquakes. Where it's colliding today with the South American continent, the ocean floor is being pushed down underneath, and of course it starts to melt, and so you get the volcanic eruptions in the Andes. You can actually trace the plates' boundaries with the earthquakes and the volcanoes. We talk about the Pacific Ring of Fire. And so the reason why this idea took off of plate tectonics was because it was a very powerful way of explaining the features that we have on the Earth's surface today, where you have volcanoes, where you have earthquakes, those sorts of issues.
And why you have that ridge at the bottom of the ocean.
Correct. Now, there's some things that the conventional plate tectonics model can't explain. And this takes us back to the flood, because as soon as you start to add in what Pellegrini was talking about, looking at the biblical view of Earth history, suddenly the model becomes more powerful and explaining more information. Now, let me step you through it. So we're saying that at the beginning of the flood, we're going to break open the ocean floor, the fountains of the great deep. So it's like the seam of a baseball. You know how you've got all the stitching on a baseball or cracks? We're going to have 70,000 miles of volcanoes suddenly exploding and molten material coming up that's going to raise the ocean floor. You're going to have the steam jets come out because of the release of fluids from inside the Earth. Those steam jets are going to take some of the ocean water and take it up into the atmosphere where it's going to drop. And the Bible talks about the windows of heaven opening, and it was torrential rainfall for 40 days and 40 nights. So the picture, it does explain that imagery that's described in the Bible. But it does more than that, because one of the things that the conventional model doesn't come to grips with is that the fossils, many of the fossils are marine creatures, and they're found buried up on the continents. And so you've got to have a mechanism from taking creatures from the ocean floor and burying them up on the continents in rock.
The hydroplate theory is when the fountains of the deep broke open in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11.
In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened.
The hydroplate theory also explains the breaking of the continents and the formation of mountains and canyons, and it explains why we have asteroids and why we find water on meteors. But the most interesting aspect about the hydroplate theory is how it explains the Ice Age. Now let's turn our attention to the Ice Age and see how it works biblically and scientifically.
Well, we're in the Mount Baker ski area near Mount Baker, with Mount Shuckson in the background over here, with this beautiful glacier on the top of it.
It's absolutely gorgeous. You don't see glaciers very often. They're kind of a unique thing, aren't they?
Well, you have to get up in the high mountains today in order to be able to see them, and they're much smaller than they used to be. Glaciers used to be much larger than this.
How big? Are we talking about just twice that size? Or?
In the past, glaciers have covered these mountains down even 3,000 feet lower than we have today. But even before that, ice sheets, which are basically glaciers on flat terrain, covered major areas of the world. For example, in North America, the ice sheets extended clear across Canada. They extended down into the United States. So that period of time when that much ice was here, that was the Ice Age.
Well, I think most people probably think if you just lower the temperature, you can get an ice age.
Well, it doesn't work that way, because you got to get the water vapor from somewhere in order to produce the snow. So somewhere you have to have warm temperatures and you have to have cold temperatures. And we believe that's what happened during the Ice Age, that in the past that the oceans were much warmer and the continents were much colder, so that when water vapor that was evaporated out of the ocean was drifted over the cold continents, it then fell out as snow and ice.
As an atmospheric scientist, what do you see in the past that would have caused those unique conditions?
From my perspective, the Bible really gives us a clue as to what happened that caused the Ice Age. The Genesis flood was a magnificent, catastrophic, high-energy event, and it left the oceans warm. And it took about 1,000 years for the ocean to cool back down to the temperature that we have today, where it's uniform. But during that period of time, particularly right after the Genesis flood, when the oceans were the warmest, it produced a tremendous amount of heat and evaporated water into the atmosphere, which then fell as the snow and the ice on the continents, forming the Ice Age. So the Genesis flood was actually the cause of the Ice Age.
Larry, that sounds like we have some very, very unique conditions then.
Yes, they were. For example, we know that there were a lot of activity in the ocean. The plates that we are aware of on the surface of the Earth today, between those plates there were cracks where magma came up, hot magma from the mantle, spewed out on the bottom of the oceans and formed a gigantic mountain chain. And that 40,000 mile long mountain chain of hot magma, as it cooled, warmed up the ocean. And we have that information from estimates of sea surface temperature from seafloor sediment data. And the conventional community believes that as well. It's just they have a...
After the global flood, there was an ice age. And when the fountains of the deep broke open, which is the hydroplate theory, this is when the Earth split apart, becoming what we see today. The water came back down and froze, becoming the Ice Age. So after the flood, there would have been the Ice Age. Breaking the global flood down to its basics, essentially it was a mass extinction event of both humans and animals. After all, the scriptures repeat this over and over again.
And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing, and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh wherein is the breath of life from under heaven. And everything that is in the earth shall die. For yet 7 days, and I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And every living substance that I have made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died.
The global flood was a mass extinction event of both animals and humans, and the Ice Age was an event that happened after the global flood. These are two key worldwide phases that can be used to determine the age of the Earth. Therefore, since we can determine the age of the Earth through mass extinction events and the Ice Age, I have a total of 6 different ages of the Earth. 2 old Earth ages, 2 Midian Earth ages, Midian meaning not too old or too young but in the middle, and 2 young Earth ages. And depending on your belief, you can choose which ones fits best for you. At the end, I'll provide my answer for what I feel is the best for me. I don't believe that the Earth or the universe is millions or billions of years old. But if the Earth is old, the oldest date I'll give it is slightly over 100,000 years old. Now, why do I say this? Because a mass extinction event occurred on the Earth 100,000 years ago. This mass extinction event wiped out most humans and animal life. Then humans and animals reappeared. According to the article at techtimes.com titled Mass Genetic Study Reveals 90% of Earth's animals appeared at the same time, it reads, landmarked new research that involves analyzing millions of DNA barcodes has debunked much about what we know today about the evolution of species. In a mass genetics study, Senior Researcher Associate at the Program of the Human Environment at Rockefeller University, Mark Stokohl, and University of Basel geneticist David Thaler discovered that virtually 90% of all animals on the earth appeared at right around the same time. More specifically, they found out that 9 out of 10 animal species on the earth came to being at the same time as humans did, some 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. This conclusion is very surprising, says Thaler, and I fought against it as hard as I could. Born around the same time. In analyzing the COI of 100,000 species, Stockhall and Thaler arrived at the same conclusion that most animals appeared simultaneously. They found that the natural mutation across species were not as varied as they expected. Natural mutation refers to the slight DNA changes that occur across generations. They can be compared to tree rings because they can tell how old a certain species or individual is. As to how that could have happened, it's unclear. A likely possibility is the occurrence of a sudden event that caused large-scale environmental trauma and wiped out majority of Earth's species. Viruses, ice ages, successful new competitors, loss of prey, all of these may cause periods when the population of animal drops sharply, explains Jesse Osseibel, director of the Program for the Human Environment. Such times give rise to sweeping genetic changes across the planet, causing new species to appear. The fact that 90% of animal life appeared at the same time as humans 100,000 years ago could signify when the animals and Noah's family came off the ark.
Bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee of all flesh, both of fowl and of cattle, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth. Chapter 9. And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth.
The flood would have been 100,000 years ago, shortly after the appearance of 90% of animals and humans at the same time. This would mean that the creation was before 100,000 years ago. Now, exactly when was the creation, we don't know. All I can say is that it was before 100,000 years ago. We don't know exactly when Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden fruit, but I don't believe Adam and Eve ate from the fruit as soon as they were created on the first day. Hypothetically, it could have been hundreds or even thousands of years before they met the serpent and ate from the fruit. Although before they ate the fruit, time wouldn't have existed in the sense that we understand it today, because they were practically immortal before they ate that fruit. I believe as soon as Adam and Eve ate the fruit, that's when they began to count the years until their death. Basically, eating the fruit was year 1, and from then on, Adam would count his years and live to be over 900 years old. But again, before he ate the fruit, he was immortal. But with all that being said, creation was at some point before 100,000 years ago. Then the flood happened 100,000 years ago, marking the arrival of animals and humans, Noah's family, simultaneously off the ark. They would then be fruitful and multiply on the face of the earth. Now for my second theory for an old earth is that 100,000 years ago could have been the actual creation of animals and humans, since they did appear roughly around the same time. Remember, virtually 90% of all animals on earth appeared right around the same time. More specifically, they found out that 9 out of 10 animal species on the planet came to being at some time as humans did some 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. And of course, this fits perfectly with Scripture.
And God said, Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God created great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And God said, Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth.
So if creation was 100,000 years ago, then when was the flood? The flood could have occurred in two events. One is during the Upper Paleolithic, which was about 50,000 years ago, and the second is the last glacial maximum, which was 20,000 years ago. The Upper Paleolithic, also called the Late Stone Age, is the third and last subdivision of the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age. Very broadly, it dates to between 50,000 and 12,000 years ago, the beginning of the Holocene. According to some theories coinciding with the appearance of behavioral modernity in early modern humans until the advent of the Neolithic Revolution in agriculture. The last glacial maximum was the most recent time during the last glacial period that ice sheets were at their greatest extent. Ice sheets covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and Asia, and profoundly affected Earth's climate by causing drought, desertification, and a large drop in sea levels. According to Clark et al., growth of ice sheets commenced 33,000 years ago, and maximum coverage was between 26,500 years ago and 19 through 20,000 years ago, when glaciation commenced in the northern hemisphere, causing an abrupt rise in sea level. Decline of the West Antarctica ice sheet occurred between 14,000 and 15,000 years ago, consistent with evidence for another abrupt rise in the sea level about 14,500 years ago. I'll touch more on the Upper Paleolithic and last glacial maximum, but the main points that you need to understand about my two old Earth ages is this. 1. Creation was before 100,000 years ago, and the flood was 100,000 years ago. And 2. Creation was 100,000 years ago, and the flood was 50,000 years ago, which is the Upper Paleolithic, or the last glacial maximum, which was 20,000 years ago, somewhere within that time frame, from 100,000 years ago to 50,000 or 20,000 years ago. But now let's cover the two Midian Earth theories. Midian again standing for in the middle, it's not too old or too young. The post-flood two Midian Earth theories. With the first Midian Earth theory, creation was before 50,000 years ago, because I'll place the aftermath of the flood in the Upper Paleolithic, which was 50,000 years ago. Now, why would I do this? Because the Upper Paleolithic is the Late Stone Age. After the flood, Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their early descendants would all have to start from scratch. Getting off the ark and roaming the earth, they wouldn't have copper, bronze, or iron tools. Everyone would have to start over, and the first thing you're going to use is stones. And during the Upper Paleolithic, humans were also beginning to develop. According to Britannica.com, Paleolithic period, also called Paleolithic period, also called Old Stone Age, Ancient Ancestral Stage, or level of human development characterized by the use of rudimentary chipped stone tools. The Paleolithic period is often divided into three parts: lower, middle, and upper. However, anthropologists resist placing hard time boundaries on each subdivision and the stages within them. These technologies, characteristic of different industries, emerged at different times in different regions. In addition, there is some level of overlap between stages and subdivisions because it took time for new technologies to spread, which created the circumstances in which some groups of people had access to higher levels of technology earlier than their contemporaries. The Upper Paleolithic, which saw the emergence of more sophisticated tools, lasted from about 50,000 through 40,000 years ago until about 10,000 years ago. Upper Paleolithic industries exhibited higher complexity, specialization, and variety of tool types, such as those made of bone, ivory, and antlers, and the emergence of distinctive regional characteristic traditions involving paintings and sculpture and musical instruments. According to Thought.com, titled Upper Paleolithic, Modern Humans Take the World, it reads, "The Upper Paleolithic, circa 40,000 through 10,000 years, was a period of great transitions in the world. Stone tools of the Upper Paleolithic were primarily blade-based technology. Blades are stone tools that are twice as long as they are wide and generally have parallel sides. They were used to create an astonishing range of formal tools created to specific, widespread patterns with specific purposes. Hunting became specialized, and sophisticated planning is shown by the culling of animals, selective choices by season, and selective butchering. The first hunter-gatherer economy, occasional mass animal killings, suggest that in some places and at some times, food storage was practiced. Some evidence suggests that small groups of people went on hunting trips and returned with meat to the base camp. And according to livescience.com, titled Back to the Stone Age, 17 Key Milestones in Paleolithic Life, there were absolutely no modern conveniences like electricity, written words, modern medicine, or the internet, to take just a few developments. But Stone Age humans still did many modern human-like things, such as eating, sleeping, making clothes, and creating music and art, such as this ivory of a human head, known as the Venus of Brasnianponi. So let's take a look at how our ancestors lived and died in the Stone Age. Archaeologists divide the Stone Age into three very broad periods before humans learned to make and use metal tools: the Paleolithic or Stone Age, the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age, and the Neolithic or New Stone Age. The Upper Paleolithic period dates from between 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, depending on the region. This was the time when autonomically modern humans, Homo sapiens. The Upper Paleolithic period was marked by big changes in stone tools. Instead of the general-purpose stone tools used for hundreds of thousands of years, specialized stone tools began to develop for specific tasks, such as hafted axes for cutting wood. This period also saw a big increase in figurative artworks, including cave paintings, rock sculptures, and bone, antler, and ivory carvings. And according to worldatlas.com, titled What Was the Upper Paleolithic Revolution?, it reads, "The Upper Paleolithic Revolution occurred during the final era of the Late Stone Age between 10,000 and 50,000 years ago, just before the practice of agriculture became widespread. This revolution is characterized by significant changes in human behavioral development that laid the foundation for modern human civilizations. The modern human species began to mobilize, traveling over long distances during this period. The earliest of these migrations was directed to present-day Australia, with humans arriving between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. This indicates the beginning of seafaring practices. Around the same time, humans in Europe had also advanced to the latitudinal line of 61 north. This was followed by arrival to Japan approximately 30,000 years ago and to the Siberian region around 27,000 years ago. Researchers believe that before this era ended, humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America and gradually migrated south. Human behavior drastically began to change during the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Though people and cultures maintained a nomadic lifestyle based on hunting and gathering, some populations began to establish permanent human settlements. These settlements are some of the first known organized permanent civilizations. Ancient humans designed these establishments to include sleeping quarters, kitchens, butchery areas, and underground storages in order to preserve food. Art and expression became an important part of society during this revolution. This need to communicate self-identity was expressed through the use of body decorations made of shells, animal teeth, ivory, and even ostrich eggshells. The first cave paintings, petroglyphs, and carvings also date back to this period. Archaeologists have also uncovered human and animal figures fashioned out of clay and stone carvings. Stone tools evolved during this period as well, evolving from more basic to more sophisticated implements. Researchers have discovered many different tools and weapons from this era, including knife blades, engraving instruments, arrow and spear points, and drilling or piercing pieces. Although commonly known as the Stone Age, not all of these artifacts were made of stone. Some discoveries have included bone, antler, or ivory pieces as well. During this time, humans also learned to apply heat to clay objects in order to harden them. Other technological advances were made to increase chances for survival as well. These advances resulted in fish hooks, rope, oil lamps, and eyed needles. So with all of that being said, here is a timeline of major events that occurred in prehistory from the Upper Paleolithic to the modern era. Creation would have been before 50,000 years ago. At some point after creation 50,000 years ago, Adam and Eve would have eaten from the forbidden fruit. The global flood would have happened sometime before the Upper Paleolithic 50,000 years ago. The Upper Paleolithic is when the early descendants of Noah got off the ark and began to use stone tools. From the Upper Paleolithic, we enter the Mesolithic, to the Neolithic, to the Chalcolithic Copper Age, to the Bronze Age, then the Iron Age and Antiquity, to the Middle Ages, and finally the modern era. The main takeaway is this: true human history starts after the flood, which would be around 50,000 years ago, the Upper Paleolithic or the Late Stone Age. The second scenario of the Midian Earth theory is that creation was before 20,000 years ago, because the aftermath of the flood will be the last glacial maximum. Now, why would I say this? Because the last glacial maximum was the last ice age. After the flood, a major ice age would occur from the water coming back down to the earth from the fountains of the deep breaking open. The last glacial maximum is the best example of this event. According to USGS.com, how does present glacial extent and sea level compare to the extent of glaciers and global sea level during the last glacial maximum? It reads, The last glacial maximum occurred about 20,000 years ago, during the late phase of the Pleistocene epoch. At that time, global sea level was more than 400 feet lower than it is today, and glaciers covered approximately 8% of Earth's surface, 25% of Earth's land area, and 33% of Alaska. And according to Thought.com, titled An Overview of the Last Global Glaciation, it reads, "When did the last ice age occur? The maximum extent of this glacial period was the last glacial maximum, and it occurred around 20,000 years ago. The last glacial period is the most heavily studied and best known portion of the Earth's current ice age, especially with regard to North America and Northern Europe." And according to smartnews.com, titled Scientists Project Precisely How Cold the Last Ice Age Was, and it reads, "About 20,000 years ago, miles of icy glaciers stretched across parts of Europe, Asia, South America, and North America, while woolly mammoths, mastodons, and saber-toothed cats roamed the land." And according to ScienceNews.com, titled How Cold Was the Ice Age, researchers now know, it reads, "Scientists have nailed down the temperature of the last ice age, the last glacial maximum of 20,000 years ago, to about 46 degrees Fahrenheit. A University of Arizona-led team has nailed down the temperature of the last ice age, the last glacial maximum of about 20,000 years ago, to about 46 degrees Fahrenheit. The last glacial maximum was a frigid period when huge glaciers covered about half of North America, Europe, and South America, and many parts of Asia, while flora and fauna that were adapted to the cold thrived." And according to Haaretz.com, titled How Cold Was the Last Ice Age, the answer may surprise you. It reads, "At the peak of the real ice age, called the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere. We also know that the start of the glacier's retreat differed from place to place. It seems Siberia's ice began to pull back about 17,500 years ago, but extreme cold persisted for thousands of years longer in Western Europe. So about 20,000 years ago, when the last glacial maximum was at its peak, the thick-furred megafauna tracked the snowy lands. The average global temperature was 6 degrees Celsius, colder than now, estimates the team led by Associate Professor Jessica E. Tenney of the University of Arizona, Tucson, in a report in Nature on Wednesday. And lastly, according to LiveScience.com, titled Pleistocene Epoch, the Last Ice Age, it reads, "The Ice Age peaked during the last glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, when the glaciers covered vast swaths of North America, Europe, South America, and Asia. At that time, global temperatures were about 11 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 degrees Celsius, lower than they are today, according to a 2020 study published in the journal Nature. Ice Age conditions were also drier than today, because most of the water on Earth's surface was ice. There was little precipitation. Rainfall was about half of current levels. The sea level was much lower, and the shorelines was typically much further out because glaciers trapped water in ice sheets, according to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. The last ice age is known for hosting many large mammals called megafauna. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, and mastodons roamed North America during this period, according to Florida Museum of Natural History. But it wasn't just large mammals. An 11-foot tall, flightless bird that weighed almost as much as a polar bear inhabited Europe during the early Pleistocene. Live Science precisely reported, meanwhile, Megalania prislea, the largest known terrestrial lizard, lived in open forests, woodlands, and other Pleistocene inhabitants across much of eastern Australia during the epoch, according to the Australian Museum in Sydney. So here's the timeline of major events from the last glacial maximum to the modern era. So creation would have been before 20,000 years ago. At some point after creation 20,000 years ago, Adam and Eve would eat from the forbidden fruit. The global flood would have happened before the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago. From the last glacial maximum, we enter the young Dryas, to the Mesolithic, to the Neolithic, to the Chalcolithic, Copper Age, to the Bronze Age, then the Iron Age and Antiquity, to the Middle Ages, and finally the modern era. The main takeaway is this: true human history starts after the flood 20,000 years ago, from Noah to us today, the last glacial maximum, the last ice age. Now, with all of that being said, the two main points that you need to understand for the Midian Earth ages is this. One, creation was before 50,000 years ago, and the flood was around 50,000 years ago during the Upper Paleolithic. And two, creation was 20,000 years ago, and the flood was around 20,000 years ago, which is the last glacial maximum. Now let's cover the two young Earth theories. Now understand with the young Earth theory, you'll slightly be pushing it. Events in human history would have to happen much faster than usual. Human development would have to be extremely rapid, and you'll basically have to condense a lot of human populations, a lot of major events that occurred, and you have to just keep all of that in mind when it comes to these two young Earth theories. But with all of that being said, if you were to go with a young Earth, my first theory for a young Earth is that creation would occur before 12,900 years ago, because I'll place the aftermath of the flood in the young Dryas period, which was 12,900 years ago. Now, why would I say this? Because the young Dryas was an ice age that occurred. After the flood, a major ice age would occur from the water coming back down to the earth from the fountains of the deep that broke open. The young Dryas is the best example of this event. The young Dryas was an abrupt period of renewed cooling between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, and had long been associated with the regrowth of glaciers in much of upland Britain. The young Dryas period was characteristic by an abrupt return to severe cold conditions following ice sheets retreat, when glaciers regrew, forming most significantly a large ice field running the length of the Western Highlands in Scotland. According to Britannica.com, titled Younger Dryas, cool period between roughly 12,900 and 11,600 years ago that disrupted the prevailing warming trend occurring in the northern hemisphere at the end of the Pleistocene epoch. The younger Dryas was characterized by cooler average temperatures that returned parts of Europe and North America to Ice Age conditions. And according to Nature Geoscience, titled Rapid Oceanic and Atmospheric Changes During the Younger Dryas Cold Period, and it reads, the Younger Dryas event, which began approximately 12,900 years ago, was a period of rapid cooling in the northern hemisphere, driven by large-scale reorganizations of patterns of atmospheric and oceanic circulation. And according to Science.com, Paleoclimate, the Younger Dryas climate event, and it reads, The Younger Dryas is the last major abrupt climate change event of the last deglaciation occurring 12,900 through 11,700 years ago. Large portions of the northern hemisphere cooled and much of the southern hemisphere warmed during the event in a bipolar seesaw pattern. And lastly, according to paleoclimatology, titled The Intriguing Problem of the Younger Dryas, What Does It Mean and What Caused It? It reads, the Younger Dryas was a period of rapid cooling in the late Pleistocene, 12,800 to 11,500 calendar years ago. It followed closely on the heels of a dramatically abrupt warming that brought the Ice Age to a close. Lasted for about 1,300 years, then ended as abruptly as it started. The cause of these remarkable sudden climate changes has puzzled geologists and climatologists for decades, and despite much effort to find the answer, can still only be considered enigmatic. The Younger Dryas returned to a cold glacial climate, was first considered to be a regional event restricted to Europe, but later studies have shown that it was a worldwide event. The Younger Dryas is within the period of the Mesolithic. The Mesolithic is part of the Stone Age, and after the flood, Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their early descendants would all have to start from scratch. Getting off the ark and roaming the earth, these people are going to use stone tools. The Mesolithic was also a time when humans were also beginning to develop rapidly. According to Britannica, titled Mesolithic, also called Middle Stone Age, ancient cultural stage that existed between the Paleolithic with its chipped stone tools and the Neolithic, New Stone Age, and its polished stone tools. And according to History.com, the prehistoric ages, how humans lived before written records, and it reads, during the Mesolithic period, about 10,000 BC to 8,000 BC, humans used small stone tools, now also polished and sometimes crafted with points and attached to antlers, bone, or wood to serve as spears and arrows. They often lived nomadically in camps near rivers and other bodies of water. Agriculture was introduced during this period, which led to more permanent settlements and villages. Finally, during the Neolithic period, roughly 8,000 BC to 3000 BC, ancient humans switched from hunter-gatherer mode to agriculture and food production. They domesticated animals and cultivated cereal grains. They used polished hand axes, adze for plowing and tilling the land, and started to settle in the plains. Advancements were made not only in tools, but also in farming, home construction, and art, including pottery, sewing, and weaving. And lastly, according to Thought.com, titled Mesolithic Period, Hunter-Gatherer Fishers in Europe, and it reads, the Mesolithic period, basically meaning Middle Stone, is traditionally a time period in the Old World between the last glaciation at the end of the Paleolithic 12,000 years ago, or 10,000 BC, the beginning of the Neolithic 5000 BCE, when the farming communities began to be established. During the Mesolithic, humans learned to hunt in groups and to fish and began to learn how to domesticate animals and plants. Climate changes during the Mesolithic included the retreat of the Pleistocene glaciers, a steep rise in sea levels, and the extinction of megafauna, large-bodied animals. These changes were accompanied by a growth in forests and a major redistribution of animals and plants. After the climate stabilized, people moved northward into precisely glacialized areas and adopted new subsistence methods. Hunter-targeted medium-bodied animals like red and roe deer, aurochs, elk, sheep, goat, and ibex. Marine mammals, fish, and shellfish were heavily used in coastal areas, and huge shell Midians are associated with Mesolithic sites along the coast throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Plant resources such as hazelnuts, acorns, and nettles became an important part of Mesolithic diet. During the Mesolithic period, humans began the first steps in land management. Swamps and wetlands were purposely burned, chipped, and ground stone axes were used to cut down trees for fires and for reconstructing living quarters and fishing vessels. Stone tools were made from microliths, tiny chips of stone made from blades or bladelets and set into toothed slots in bone or antler shifts. Tools made of composite material, bone, antler, wood, combined with stone, were used to create a variety of harpoons, arrows, and fish hooks. Nets and sardines were developed for fishing and trapping small game. The first fish wires, deliberate traps placed in streams, were constructed. Boats and canoes were built, and the first roads, created wooden trackways, were built to safely cross wetlands. Pottery and ground tools were first made during the late Mesolithic, although they did not come into prominence until the Neolithic. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers moved seasonally following animal migrations and plant changes. In many areas, large permanent or semi-permanent communities were located on the coast, with smaller contemporary hunting camps located further inland. Mesolithic houses had sunken floors which varied in outline from round to rectangular and were built of wooden posts around a central hearth. Interactions between Mesolithic groups included the widespread exchange of raw materials and finished tools. Genetic data suggests that there was also large-scale population movement and intermarriage across Eurasia. Recent archaeological studies have convinced archaeologists that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were instrumental in beginning the long, slow process of domesticating plants and animals. The traditional switch to Neolithic way of life was fueled in part by an intensifying emphasis on those resources rather than the fact of domestication. The first Mesolithic tombs, collective burial places constructed of large stone blocks, were constructed at the end of the Mesolithic period. The oldest of these are the Upper Alentejo region of Portugal, and along the Brittany coast. They were constructed between 4700 through 4500 BCE. In general, hunter-gatherer fishers such as the Mesolithic people of Europe exhibited significantly lower levels of violence than do herders and horticulturalists. But by the end of the Mesolithic 5000 BCE, a very high percentage of skeletons recovered from Mesolithic burials show some evidence of violence. 44% in Denmark, 20% in Sweden and France. Archaeologists suggest that the violence arose towards the end of the Mesolithic because of social pressures resulting from competitions for resources, as Neolithic farmers vied with hunter-gatherers over rights to land. With that being said, here's a timeline of major events from the Younger Dryas to the modern era. So creation would have been before 12,900 years ago. At some point after creation, 12,900 years ago, Adam and Eve would have eaten from the forbidden fruit. The global flood would have happened sometime before the Younger Dryas, which was 12,900 years ago. From the Younger Dryas, you have the Mesolithic to the Neolithic to the Chalcolithic to the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age, and antiquity to the Middle Ages, and finally the modern era. The main takeaway is this: true human history starts after the flood 12,900 years ago, from Noah to us today, the Younger Dryas, the Ice Age. Now, with all of that being said, as I stated before, with a younger Earth, you'll slightly be pushing it. You know, human events will have to happen extremely fast. Human history, as well as other major events in the world, and everything will have to be much more rapid. So keep that in mind if you go with a young Earth. So my second theory for a young Earth is that creation would have occurred before 11,700 years ago, because I'll place the aftermath of the flood in the Holocene, which was 11,700 years ago. Now, why do I say this? Because the Holocene is around the time of the Neolithic, when humans truly began to develop. The Neolithic was around the time of agricultural revolution. The domestication of animals, pastoralism, and farming was key in this period, which one could argue if they believe that the Earth is young. After the flood 11,700 years ago, during the Holocene and the Neolithic, mankind had somewhat of a rapid development. The Holocene is the current geological epoch. It began approximately 11,650 years ago, after the last glacial period, which concluded with the Holocene glacial retreat. The Holocene corresponds with the rapid proliferation, growth, and impacts of human species worldwide, including all of its written history, technological revolutions, developed of major civilizations, and overall significant transitions towards urban living in the present. According to Berkeley University, titled The Holocene Epoch, it reads, "The Holocene is the name given to the last 11,700 years of Earth's history, the time since the beginning of the last major glacial epoch, or Ice Age." And according to ncdc.gov, titled Mid-Holocene Warm Period, and it reads, "We are in a current Holocene interglacial which began about 11,500 years ago." And according to Britannica.com, titled Holocene Epoch, and it reads, "Holocene, or recent epoch, younger of the two formerly recognized epochs that constitute the Quaternary period at the latest interval of geologic time, covering approximately the last 11,700 years of Earth's history. The sediments of the Holocene, both continental and marine, cover the largest area of the globe of any epoch in the geologic record. But the Holocene is unique because it is coincident with the late and post-Stone Age history of humankind. The influence of humans is of world extent, and is profound that it seems appropriate to have a special geologic name for this time. And according to livescience.com, Holocene Epoch, the Age of Man, and it reads, "The Holocene Epoch is a current period of geologic time. The Holocene Epoch began 12,000 to 11,500 years ago at the close of the Paleolithic Ice Age and continues through today. As Earth entered a warming trend, the glaciers of the late Paleolithic retreated. Tundra gave way to forests as the climate changed. The very large mammals that had adapted to extreme cold, like mammoth and woolly rhinoceros, became extinct. Humans, once dependent on these megamammals for much of their food, switched to smaller game and increased their gathering of plants materials to supplement their diet. Evidence indicates that about 10,800 years ago, the climate underwent a sharp cold turn lasting for several years. The glaciers did not return, but the game and plant materials would have been scarce. As temperatures began to rebound, human populations began to increase, and we began inventing the processes that would change the planet forever. Agriculture is one of the primary ways in which human activity has impacted the planet. By 8000 BC, the cultivation of wheat, barley, and other plants had spread from its origin in the Fertile Crescent through much of the Indo-European world. Domestication of sheep and goats and cattle began at about the same time. In Central and South America, the most commonly domesticated plants were maize, bottle gourds, squash, and beans. Farming seems to have gotten a later start in Asia. Current evidence suggests that it may have been introduced to China by trade with Indo-European tribes, although it appears to have been common by the time of the first start of the Shang dynasty in about 1675 BC. Now let's get into the Neolithic. The Neolithic period is the final division of the Stone Age, with a wide range of set of developments that appeared to have arisen independently in several parts of the world. It is first seen about 12,000 years ago, when the first development of farming appeared in the Epi-Paleolithic Near East, and later in other parts of the world. The Neolithic lasted in that part of the world until the transitional period of the Chalcolithic from about 6,500 years, 4,500 BC, marked by the development of metallurgy leading up to the Bronze Age and Iron Age. Following the ASPRO chronology, the Neolithic started in around 10,200 BC in the Levant, arising from the Natufian culture. And the Natufians, by the way, are a very important Near Eastern population because they may represent the descendants of Shem. But let's keep reading. When pioneering use of wild cereals evolved into early farming, the Natufian period, or Proto-Neolithic, lasted from 12,500 to 9,500 BC and is taken to overlap with the pre-Pottery Neolithic PPNA, or 10,200 through 8,800 BC, as the Natufians had become dependent on wild cereal in their diet and a sedentary way of life had begun among them. The climatic changes associated with the younger Dryas about 10,000 BC are thought to have forced people to develop farming. By 10,200 through 8,800 BC, farming communities had arisen in the Levant and spread to West Asia, North Africa, and North Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the site of the earliest development of the Neolithic Revolution from around 10,000 BC. Early Neolithic farming was limited to a narrow range of plants, both wild and domesticated, which include einkorn wheat, millet, and spelt. The keeping of dogs, by about 8,000 BC, it included domesticated sheep and goats, cattle, and pigs. And according to history.com, Neolithic Revolution, and it reads, the Neolithic Revolution, also called the Agricultural Revolution, marked the transition in human history from small nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers to large agricultural settlements and early civilization. The Neolithic Revolution started around 10,000 BC in the Fertile Crescent, a boomerang-shaped region of the Middle East, where humans first took up farming. Shortly after, Stone Age humans in other parts of the world had begun to practice agriculture. Civilizations and cities grew out of the innovations of the Neolithic Revolution. And according to nationalgeographic.com, what was the Neolithic Revolution? The Neolithic Revolution was referred to the Agricultural Revolution. It is thought to have begun about 12,000 years ago. It coincided with the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the current geological epoch, the Holocene. It is forever changed how humans live, eat, and interact, paving the way for modern civilization. During the Neolithic period, hunter-gatherers roamed the natural world, foraging for their food, but then a dramatic shift occurred. The foragers became farmers, transitioning from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a more settled one. And according to worldhistoryencyclopedia.com, titled Neolithic Period, and it reads, the term Neolithic or New Stone Age is more frequently used in connection with agriculture, which is the time when cereal cultivation and animal domestication was introduced, because agriculture developed at different times in different regions of the world. There is no single date for the beginning of the Neolithic. In the Near East, agriculture was developed around 9000 BCE, in Southeast Europe around 7000 BCE, and later in other regions. Even within a specific region, agriculture developed during different times. For example, agriculture first developed in Southeast Europe about 7000 BCE, in Central Europe about 5500 BCE, and Northern Europe about 4000 BCE. In East Asia, the Neolithic goes back 6000 to 2000 BCE. And last, according to Britannica.com, titled Neolithic, it reads, archaeological evidence indicates that the transition from food collecting cultures to food producing ones gradually occurred across Asia and Europe from the starting point in the Fertile Crescent. The first evidence of cultivation and animal domestication in southwestern Asia has been dated to roughly 9500 BCE, which suggests that those activities may have begun before that date. A way of life based on farming and settled villages had been firmly achieved by 7000 BCE in the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, and in what is now Syria, Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. Those earliest farmers raised barley and wheat and kept sheep and goats, and later supplemented by cattle and pigs. Their innovations spread from the Middle East northward into Europe by two routes, across Turkey and Greece into Central Europe, and across Egypt and North Africa, and thence to Spain. Farming communities appeared in Greece as early as 7000 BCE, and farming spread northward throughout the continent over the next 4 millennia. This long and gradual transition was not completed in Britain and Scandinavia until after 3000 BCE and is known as the Mesolithic. So with all of that being said, here is a timeline of major events from the Holocene and the Neolithic to the modern era. So creation would have been before 11,700 years ago. At some point after creation, which was again 11,700 years ago, Adam and Eve would eat from the forbidden fruit. The global flood would have happened sometime before the Holocene, again, which was around 11,700 years ago. From the Holocene and the Neolithic to the Chalcolithic to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age to Antiquity and the Middle Ages, and finally the modern era. So the main takeaway is this: true human history starts after the flood, which begins around 11,700 years ago, from Noah to us today, the Holocene and the Neolithic. But here are the main points that you need to take away when it comes to the two young Earth ages. With a young Earth, again, like I said, you are pushing human history, like you're really pushing it. Just keep that in mind. Human events, world events, even genetic occurrences within humanity, all of that will have to happen rapidly. So keep that in mind if you go with a young Earth. Civilizations and human populations, all of that would have to happen much rapidly, the development of humans, if you go with basically a 12,000 or 11,000 year old Earth. But with that being said, number one, creation was before 12,900 years ago, and the flood was around 12,900 years ago during the young Dryas. And two, creation was before 11,700 years ago, and the flood was around 11,700 years ago, which is the Holocene. So now we've reached the end of the video, and so here is just a quick reminder of all of the ages of the Earth. Now for my personal opinion for the age of the Earth, I'll go with just simply 3 different theories that I think I like the most. So I have an old Earth, a Midian, and a young Earth, just in case people want to know when it comes to all 3 stages. So for an old Earth, I would say that creation was before 100,000 years ago, and the flood was around 100,000 years ago. Basically, the post-flood event for an old Earth, again around 100,000 years ago, is that mass extinction event. Now for a Midian Earth, I would say that creation was before 20,000 years ago, and the flood was the last glacial maximum. After the flood, the last glacial maximum would appear. And basically the post-flood event would be the Ice Age, when the water came back down. And for a young Earth, I would say creation was before 12,900 years ago, and the flood was before the young Dryas period. Basically, the post-flood event for a young Earth, which again is around 12,900 years ago, would be that mini Ice Age / warming event that occurred after.
Let's now review the main events in the Genesis record in light of the topics we've covered in the hydroplate theory. The flood begins on the 17th of the 2nd month of Noah's 600th year, with the catastrophic rupture of Earth's granitic shell. Deep interconnected chambers of water burst out as great fountains from the deep. Heavy rain falls from the fountains for 40 straight days, then suddenly stops even though the waters continue rising. In the early stages after the rupture, some regions of Earth are buried in supercold hail and muck, trapping, freezing, and preserving mammoths and many other plants and animals. At the same time, Earth's hydroplates are fluttering from the powerful horizontal flow of the ocean of escaping water below. The resulting pressure waves in the granite's quartz produces huge voltages which arc within, producing focused nuclear fusion and fission events, which birth Earth's heavy radioactive elements. The chaotic environment filled with many high-speed subatomic particles bombard the new, fragile heavy nuclei, greatly accelerating their decay rates. The heat generated greatly accelerates the flow of the escaping fountains. Some materials swept up in the violent hypersonic flow of the pulsing fountains are accelerated to such high speeds that they escape Earth's gravitation. An ocean of water, rocks, minerals, gases, dust, and organic remnants are blasted from Earth into the solar system, eventually becoming what are now observed as comets, asteroids, meteoroids, and trans-Neptunian objects. Floodwaters continue to rise even though the rains have stopped, as subterranean waters continue to escape from below. Plants and animals are buried in the muddy waters and eroded sediments. Repeated liquefaction of sediments produces stratified layers in which buried animals and plants are sorted into a sequence that some today mistakenly claim was produced by millions of years of evolution. After about 150 days, the hydroplate's perimeters have been eroded hundreds of miles and have thinned, forming continental shelves and slopes. The mantle floor can no longer support the imbalance from the missing material and bulges up, producing the mid-oceanic ridge. Rapid continental drift begins as plates slide away from the rising mantle floor. Soon the plates crash into the mantle floor as they run out of the lubricating water below. The compression event crushed and thickened the hydroplates and formed mountain chains. As that land thickened and rose, the floodwaters drained into very deep ocean basins. Much of the world's buried plant life is compressed and heated, forming many coal and oil deposits. The big roll of Earth's surface begins. After 150 days, the ark comes to rest on a newly formed mountain rising out of the waters. Meanwhile, the rising Atlantic seafloor causes shearing far below, and Earth's core begins melting and contracting as it extrudes toward the rising Atlantic. The Pacific hydroplate on the opposite side of Earth is pulled deep down under miles of rising magma, which is expanding up from the crossover density boundary. The Pacific seafloor is then covered in volcanic seamounts. A great wind is observed as the atmosphere adjusts to the subsiding Pacific plate, and ocean trenches are produced by the deformations. For centuries afterward, heat from the rising magma warms the oceans, greatly increasing evaporation rates. That, in combination with the newly formed continents yet to fully sink into the mantle, cause Earth's first and only ice age. 74 days after landing on Mount Ararat, surrounding mountains finally become visible. Noah begins sending birds out in regular 7-day intervals, observing their behavior. After 314 days since the flood, land is fully visible. Noah uncovers the ark. Apparently conditions are still too unstable to exit. Finally, 57 days later, after 371 days since the rupture, the land is dry and stable enough for all to exit the ark. Unbeknownst to Noah's family, the melting inner Earth is gradually increasing Earth's spin rate. The 360-day calendar they've used to chronologically track these events will soon be obsolete and confuse many generations of their offspring. As the newly formed mountains slowly settle into the mantle, frictional heating melts rock, generating magma. The magma is then injected under the adjacent crust, causing the weakest portions of the crust to fracture and rise to become plateaus. As the thickened continents sink into the mantle, the initially deep ocean floors rise to today's level in compensation for the downward flow of mass. Of course, sea levels rose with the ocean floors, and the continents were divided by water in the days of Peleg.
So, summary and conclusion. The hydroplate theory proves the global flood, and the global flood and the hydroplate theory proves the Ice Age and a mass extinction event, followed by the Stone Age and human development, which all can prove the age of the earth, beginning from Noah to us today, depending on how old you believe the earth is. With all of that being said, choose whichever model best fits for your world view. With that being said, have a blessed day and shalom.